So, will you start by stating your full name, please?
Veronica Brennan.
Thank you. And I am obliged to read this out to you.
Yes.
By taking part in this project, you are agreeing to your image and voice being used for any appropriate and relevant purpose as seen fit by the Inverclyde Community Development Trust and being stored in an archive which will be made available to the public.
Well, hopefully that won't be a problem.
At the end of this, you'll obviously get to see what we produced before it.
Yes,
goes
worldwide, global.
Absolutely. If there's anything that you have reservations
of course,
about, then
of course.
you can
yes,
to have anything
of
taken
course.
out.
That's right.
Okay.
I can imagine there could be quite a lot of reservations
Was
once
it
I've
so?
seen myself.
I didn't
Yes.
mean just if your hairstyle
Exactly,
was not
that's
your liking
right.
or
Sorry,
what.
I had forgotten to go to the hairdressers.
So, your name wasn't always Veronica Brennan?
No, it was not. That's been the easier half of my life when I go to laundries, laundrettes, etc. and I'm asked to give my name, because before that it was Veronica Kuszinska.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to spell that every time and also pronounce it again for people. And they were always so surprised that if they just listened carefully, it was so easy to pronounce. It was just the initial look on people's faces. And obviously, you know, it's Polish, Veronica Kuszinska. And my brothers, the males of the family, were Kuczynski. Their names ended in an I, but it's the tradition in that country and in other countries to have different endings for male and female. So it's Kuczynska. Yes.
So where did your father come from? Tell me about his life in Poland.
My father came from an area in Poland which was under German occupation, so it was tended to the northwest of Poland in a place called Lipnica. And he lived in a farm. He lived on a farm because his father was a farmer, but also the local undertaker as well. And Dad would talk about the horses, you know, with the black plumes and the carriage, etc., etc. And they lived in this farm, and Dad went to the local school, but also learned how to play the organ as well while he was growing up. And the schoolmaster seemed to have been one of these very old domini types, because he seemed to have a library full of books. And by the time, obviously, I knew Dad, he didn't read very much, but he said he had read so much when he was a child growing up in this village in Poland because of the local teacher, the local dominie, because you were allowed to, and he said he'd read things like Victor Hugo, etc., etc. And we were quite surprised at this, you know, because with visions of a much, a life, very low-key life, but he'd learned to play the church organ and read all these books, that he'd had really a very full education, and also knew quite a lot about work on a farm. And, you know, because he was allowed to have a pet sheep in his bedroom, which apparently he overfed. And another time he talked about the owl, which he had in his bedroom as well, which tore all the curtains. So you can imagine Babka, my grandmother, would be livid at this. And he also learned cabinet making as well, which was to become a trade of his later on.
Yeah. What was your father's name?
My father's name was Joseph, Jozef, the Polish spelling of it, Joseph Kuszinski. His father was Jan Kuszinski and his mother was Veronica Kuszinska. And I'm called after Babka. Yes, we were all my family were called after grandparents, so I was lucky enough to be called
Do you
after
think
her.
it was, I was just thinking this before we met, do you think it was a deliberate policy of your parents to alternate, you know, your siblings are alternating each side of the family?
Yes,
I mean,
well, it
was
deliberate up to a point. My oldest sister was called Euphemia after my Scottish grandmother. I was always glad I wasn't actually the first girl in the family. Then my brother Jan was obviously named after my paternal grandfather. I was named Veronica, but then the next boy who came along was called Joseph, after my dad. Now, Joseph died when he was 6 months old, so they broke the trend. But then when my next brother came along, he was called Dennis after my maternal grandfather. So it certainly was alternated up till Joseph.
So when was your father born?
My father was born on the 5th of April 1911, 1911.
And what brothers and sisters did he have?
Well, he had a sister, Helena, who was she was killed as a child by a cart going through the village street. And he had a brother, Jan, a brother, Adam, and a sister, Regina. And he told us many stories of growing up there, of the Cossacks coming through the village, on their horses, he said, with their swords flashing. I'm sure there was some embellishment there, but there was real truth in it. And he said that the children would all be out milling around. He said it was a great spectacle, and he said they obviously meant us no harm, because he said that they always missed us. And another story I remember, which was a vivid one, was he said that the railway track would go up a hill near where they lived, and the train would have to slow down, and it was carrying coal, etc. And he said it was times of great poverty and great hardship. And he said they, as children, he and the others in the village, would jump on the train and shovel off coal onto the side of the hill. And he said there was a guard on this train who would fire at them. But he said again, it was obvious that the shots were being fired over their head. It was more to frighten them than anything else. And he said then after the train would go, we would gather the coal and take it back for our needs. And also he said his father fought in the German army during World War I, but then came back, and when he came back, he looked after Russian prisoners of war who lived in the forest near where their farm was. And he said occasionally my grandfather, his father, would bring back one prisoner at a time to help feed them, and give them stew and so on. And he said, I remember these men being so hungry that they would put their bare hands into the pot of soup or stew on the stove. He said they were so desperately hungry. And these were just some of the stories that I was brought up with, and my siblings were brought up with, and they were just, he told them so vividly, and that they painted such pictures for us of a totally different life.
Indeed, yeah. What about language? The official language was German.
Yes.
But did they speak Polish at home?
Oh, yes. That was a very big part of their lives, the patriotism and their national identity. They absolutely hated the fact that they were occupied by the Germans. And my father and the others in the family, the males, refused to change the spelling of their name, because the spelling of their name was changed to the German version, which was Kusinski instead of Kuszynski. And there are, I remember seeing some documentation with Kusinski, but that was, the Germans had insisted on this. And so Dad was able to speak German and was supposed to speak German when he was in school. But they spoke Polish as their language.
Yeah. So then let's move on to the wartime.
Yes.
Nearer that time. Tell me what happened then.
Do you mean the Second World War?
Yes, the Second War.
Prior to the Second World War, my dad, Joseph, was already in the Navy. He was what he called a conscript. So he was in the regular Polish Navy. And he said that, I think it was about 1938, but I might be wrong, his ship ORP Garland and other ships of the Polish Navy rather, were all lined up in the Kiel Canal. And he said a launch passed up between the ships, and he said on it was Hitler. He said he saw Hitler as he was standing on the ship, and he was doing a review of the Polish Navy. And he said, we knew, as we had known before then, that war was imminent, he said, and also the fact that some relatives of his had already been taken to concentration camps. Relatives of his who had fairly senior jobs in railways, etc., were taken to concentration camps. And also he said the last time he saw his father was a year or two before war actually broke out, and he said they knew it was the last time they would possibly see one another because of my father being in the Navy and would have to fight because he was already in the Navy. And he said after the salute to Hitler that they were supposed to give, he said we knew then that war was imminent and we were going to join the British Navy, lend our support to them. And so that's what the Polish Navy did.
Yes.
They lent their support to the British Navy.
So what happened to his father and the others?
His father and his mother, my grandparents, were on the farm, and the younger children, that was Adam and Regina and Jan, were still there with them, and they gradually smuggled the family away. Regina was smuggled out to make a new life in America, in Chicago, which, as we all know, has a big Polish population. Jan was smuggled out and sent to Canada, and Adam went to Holland. And that's where the three of them lived for the rest of their lives.
Were you in touch with them?
We were in touch with them,
on.
yes, later on, and we actually met Uncle Adam because of the proximity of Holland. He used to come over at Christmas time and he would bring such goodies from Holland. He was a bachelor, but he also was a designer and designed washing machines and various other furniture and so on. And we used to love when he came over at Christmas time because, again, he brought these beautiful toys which they had on the continent, and leather goods and sweeties and all sorts, and it was just, as I say, magical. And on Christmases when he wasn't coming over, he would send boxes with tangerines and all sorts of goods we really couldn't get in this country. And he would say this, so it was always, we thought the world of him as children. When I never met any of the others, I saw photographs of them and their families. My brother Jan, who later, when he grew up, joined the Merchant Navy, met my uncle Jan and his wife Eva in Canada, and he couldn't get over the remarkable resemblance to my father, and he thought it was he said it was just uncanny, but the rest of us never met them. But as I say, we would see photographs which they would send to Babka, who later on came to live with us. So that left my grandparents on the farm.
What about the other sister, Helena, was it?
Helena had died as a child. Yes, she had died tragically.
Yes.
Babka and my grandfather were left in the farm, and my grandfather apparently had a radio which was fairly secret and was able to pick up on the world news, and they could see how the war was progressing, or hear how the war was progressing. And one evening, the Gauleiter of the district, the German who was in charge of that district, and making sure everything was going according to the law, came to the door. Now, Helmut Hanke, the Gauleiter, had been a childhood friend of my dad's. Even although they didn't like German occupation, it was like everything else, you were friendly with your contemporaries. And Helmut came to my grandparents' farm and said that it was known that they had a radio, and this was an example of somebody on the opposite side being a good friend, because he warned my grandfather rather than arresting him, and said, look, we know you've got the radio, so, and they're coming to get you. So Babka and my grandfather then packed up all that they could in a cart and headed for, as I said, one day the Russians were advancing and another day the Germans, so it was caught between two stools, and I don't know the details of their journey or anything like that, but my grandfather died on the journey. Again, I don't know whether it would be a heart attack or, pneumonia, whatever. But so that was just what happened to them. But they were about to be arrested, but as I say, the Gauleiter, the friend, had warned them.
Where were they heading for?
I don't know. I don't know where, as I say, it's one of those things that I just don't know where they would be heading for at all.
But we'll come back to Babka's story.
Yes, of
later.
course,
Yeah.
of course.
So what about your father's adventures during the war then?
Well, Dad then, as I say, the Polish Navy joined forces with the British Navy, and then they came to Greenock, and they were birthed in Greenock. And my father's faith, Poland's a Catholic country, and his faith was always very, very important to him, and he would always make his way to a church. And he was, obviously, St Mary's Church in Greenock was close to where his ship was berthed, and my mother's family were a kind of well-kent St Mary's Parish family, and they had what would be called a relatively large house, and people would lodge with them, like priests, like army chaplains, etc., or naval chaplains would come and lodge with them, because the priest would ask if they could lodge there. And so I don't know whether this could be called arrangements of any kind, but the local priest took my father and his friend Stanisław Jaczynski along to the Murphy household. Now, at this point, I must say the Murphys had 3 daughters, so there was maybe some method in the madness. But anyway, they went along there and they were made very welcome. And that's not necessarily where the friendship stemmed from, because I can't see my granny encouraging the sailors, knowing her. But Mrs. Player, a lady called Mrs. Player in Greenock, had a canteen which was run for sailors and servicemen, and I think it was in Grey Place.
Right, yeah.
Yes, and my mother worked in the canteen there. That wasn't her everyday occupation, but all the nice girls love a sailor, and my mother was no exception. And
I think a few romances.
yes,
started in that cafe.
Mrs. Plair's canteen, and my dad would go to Mrs. Plair's canteen as well, and I think romance blossomed, obviously. And then Dad was away on the convoys, and he was actually one of the ships which went on the Murmansk convoys, the ones to the Arctic. He was on one of those, and, as I say, which apparently were very, very difficult, the ones going up north. And I've seen photographs of his ship, and all the rigging, etc., is covered in thick ice and, so on. And he went to, Canada, etc., and he would come back from Canada with a lot of food stuff. They were able to sort of maybe fill a suitcase with food that had been we would have them rationed here, but not there. And so he was able to bring back suitcases of tinned ham, peaches, whatever. And I always remember my mother and father talking about Granny Murphy. When the little sisters would come to the door, they would be given some of these luxury goods while everybody else was going, no, for us, because, as I say, it was such a novelty. And as I say, he and my mother did get married, you know. And
so tell me about your mother's family then, and your grandparents.
Do you mean
your maternal?
My maternal,
side.
right. Yeah. Well, that was Euphemia and Dennis Murphy, my maternal grandparents. And Dennis Murphy, there was quite an age difference between Femi and Dennis, because Dennis had fallen in love with, you know, this young lady, but he had a mother and 2 sisters to look after. So he was not, it seems strange to us nowadays, but in those days, not free to marry because of these commitments. But when his mother died and he saw his sister settled, he then married my grandmother. But there was about a 20 to 30 year age gap. My grandfather, Dennis, was what I think would be called now a rag and bone man, but one of my aunts, one of his daughters, was heard to describe him as a marine store dealer.
Nice. Your mother told me he was a ship's chandler.
Well, our ship's chandler, but really when stories come out I wasn't quite sure. But that was over Stanner Street, Rouen Street, and my grandmother had been a teacher, a pupil teacher, and you know, as was in those days, a pupil teacher, somebody who was older, 9, 10 than the other children, but then was put in front of the infants, etc., to teach them. And also tales of her going down the Vennel, because there would be some children who wouldn't come into school, and so she would be sent down there to fetch them out. And then when her own parents heard about that, they went berserk, because it was a pretty dangerous activity for a child to be involved with. But she was, as I say, a pupil teacher and a wonderful seamstress as well. You know, she made, you know, she was a very good seamstress. They lived in West Stewart Street, they lived in Brisbane Street, and then eventually settled in Eldon Street. I never met my grandfather. He died while my mother was in school. My mother and her sisters went to boarding school. She had 2 sisters, and Rosie and Mary, and a brother Bobby. Her 2 sisters and herself went to St Margaret's in Paisley, which was a boarding school, and her brother went away to be a priest and studied in England. Bobby studied in England. The priesthood was not to be for him, and he returned home when he was possibly about 18, and then trained to be a doctor, and did become a doctor. He was killed in Burma in the Second World War, but my mother and her sisters lived all of their lives in Gourock and Greenock, and lived well into their 90s, as did my grandmother as well. So I knew my grandmother until I was about 21.
Were your grandparents both born here?
Yes, they were both born here. My mother's, you know, my mother's mother, I think, was a lady's maid, and her father was a delivery person, and her mother's name was Pringle, and she came from Peebles. I'm not sure where her father came from. Must have been Ireland, because it was Keith was her own name, and they got married, but the exact circumstances I'm not sure of. My father's family came from Waterford in Ireland.
Your mother's father's?
My mother's father, yes.
Yeah.
And they had other relatives of toys in Greenock as well. And as I say, they lived in Eldon Street latterly.
So, when your mother and father got married, was that after the war?
No, my mother and father got married during the war in 1942, February the 24th, 1942, and they had the wedding party in the house in 29 Eldon Street, and again the food had come and the cake etc. from Canada because my father had brought it home on a trip. And then my mother continued to live in 29 Eldon Street while my father went to sea. She went to various places like Troon, when there would maybe be... my father was the chief petty officer on the ship, so he had a lot to do with the running of the ship, with repairs, etc. So if the ship had to be in dry dock, then she could go and join him, and the north of England, Troon, etc., and she would go and join him in lodgings there if the ship was in dry dock, But as I say, it was quite often it came into Greenock, which was very convenient.
Yeah. So, what family did they have?
Well, my mum and dad had 5 children. Started off with my older sister, Euphemia, named after maternal granny, a good Scottish name, and she was born in what was the Larkfield Hospital in those days, and she was followed by Jan, my older brother, and again Larkfield Hospital. And then for some reason there was no room in the Larkfield Hospital or something like that, because you had to book in advance apparently for these places. I was born in 29 Eldon Street in the upper room, shall we say, and my mother said it was great, and it was in one of the snowiest years, 1947.
You don't have to say that.
I know, in the 9th of January 1947, and she said if I'd even wanted to go somewhere I probably couldn't have got there. And then that was followed by my younger brother, one of my younger brothers, Joseph, who was born in St Francis's in Glasgow, and he was poorly from birth, I would say, but was taken home and died when he was 6 months old. And then later on, we had moved out of Eldon Street by this time. We still stayed in Eldon Street all of these years. 3 of us were born while we lived in Eldon Street. And with my aunt and my grandmother, my Aunt Mary lived in the house as well. And then we moved to... when Babka was staying there as well, and then we moved to Brisbane Street with Babka, and Dennis was born in Brisbane Street. And I remember being wakened one night in June, and it was about midnight, and we were told to get dressed, and Babka was going to take us down to Eldon Street because a birth was imminent and we weren't to be at home. And so the 3 of us, Fime, Jan and myself, walked down in the middle of the night, which was a huge adventure, with Babka to my grandmother's house. And Dennis was born.
So, we better talk about Babka. Where had she been all this time? Tell me this part of the story.
Now, Babka, as I've mentioned earlier, is my grandmother, and we've just always called her Babka, the Polish for Babka. And my father didn't see his family at all during all the war years. And then after the war, he decided that he would try to make contact with his family in Poland, if indeed any of them were still alive. So he submitted a photograph of himself to the Red Cross, who obviously, provided a service of trying to reconnect families in where it was necessary, and he gave in a photograph. Never really thinking there would be a great deal of success, but eventually the photograph of himself was recognised by a lady in a displaced persons camp in Austria, and that lady was Babka. So of course there was great rejoicing and amazed, and of course the sadness as well, because then my father would know that his father had died, because he wouldn't have known prior to that, because they would have been, you know, not able to make contact because they had left the farm, and obviously my father had got married in the interim, and indeed I, you know, was like a year old at this time, so he had 3 children. So Babka was brought over, obviously, and she was in her 60s and had, you know, a very traumatic life. But I remember her arriving, and she had the most beautiful doll, a life-sized, like, china doll. And where she'd got it, I don't know, but she had brought this doll with her, you know, with rosy cheeks, one of these really old-fashioned dolls, and a very small brown suitcase, and dressed completely in black,
Was it a Polish doll?
No, it was just a big, fat baby doll, which was given to my older sister. Oh. So I think the green-eyed monster glowed quite brightly in my eyes, but this, I just remember, like, what was all this? I mean, I was only 1, remember, but I was quite, in material terms, I was aware of the doll. That? Yes, yeah. Oh, I do. Yeah. As I say, it's quite a vivid memory. And so Babka came to stay with us.
It's hard just to think what she must have felt. Oh. You know.
I remember my mother saying on reflection that when Babka came, Babka was in her mid-60s. And in those days, people in their mid-60s are different from people in their mid-60s now. She said, you know, that it was just the situation and, you know, people's expectations and so on. And she said, I took her through the town, this lady who had not a word of English, and showed her everything and bombarded her with all sorts of information to make her feel welcome and so on. And she said it was in reflection, I thought, my goodness, she must have just wanted a bit of peace and quiet. But, you know, it was just all this, and she'd been very, very traumatised. My father had always spoken about Babka being extremely brave when people would come, when he remembers as a child, like soldiers coming to the farm window and battering at the windows and the door. My grandmother would be the one. He said he and his father and brothers would be cowering somewhere, but Babka would be the one to remind them of their manners and etc., etc. This was to take its toll later on in her life, but he said that she had always been very you know, strong and brave, but she was quite a small woman. But no, I do remember her coming, and then, as I say, you know, my mother and everybody realising how difficult it was at the time of this lady's life to have a whole change and to leave everything, more or less, certainly coming to her son and his family, but the trauma of the language, etc., must have been quite difficult.
Did she learn much English?
Well, my mother worked as a teacher. My father was out working as a cabinet maker, and that my older brother and sister were one was at school, one was about to go to school, and I was at home with Babka and my maternal gran. And Babka and I were together most of the time. She kind of took me over, and we would go out walking, we would play up in the upstairs bedroom, and we would chat. And what Babka spoke to me is what I could only describe as pidgin English. Mm-hmm. And I was one of the few people. My father obviously spoke Polish to Babka, and she to him. And she and I spoke in pidgin English, and I would translate to others in the family what babka meant. Babka hab sum gehen zum deni bathroom, or haben sie their dinner. And you can see that there's the odd German in there, and that was because of the German influence in babka, mixing it all up. And, so as a child, I spoke with her, and as I say, she and I spent a lot of time together.
Did you get some Polish from her?
No, not really, because my father didn't speak Polish to us. No. He was desperate to learn English, and so that he didn't speak Polish to us.
When your grandmother was in the camp in Austria, would it be German?
It would be German, and as I say, she would speak a lot of German when in the occupied years, and so there was a lot of German. And she, as I say, we spent a lot of time together and out walking, and she was a very, very religious person, and she would go to visit practically all of the churches in Greenock on a daily basis. I would go with her sometimes and sometimes not, but she was a well-kent figure walking from St Mary's, St Patrick's, St Andrews, etc.
I can see her in my mind walking up Patrick Street from St Mary's with the long black coat
and the black hat. That's right, indeed, and as I say, just very, just a calm, still figure. And as you say, walking everywhere. It was because of this, I remember we took her as a family to see The Robe and Bernadette of Lourdes because we felt, and again that must have been quite strange for her as well, but we thought because of the religious theme, she would enjoy this. Maybe she would have preferred Titanic or a good cowboy film, but we're never to know. And as I say, so she lived with us in Brisbane Street.
When your father arrived here, did he speak much English?
No, he didn't, but he picked it up very quickly. He was keen to learn English, and obviously once he was in the family, my mother's family, it would only be with friends after the war when he saw them that he would get to speak Polish. And we did have people who came.
I remember him being in our house. He did some work for my mother. He French polished a table.
Yes.
And I was just small at the time, and I remember thinking it was just
beautiful.
But I remember him sitting having his cup of tea, and they were talking about language, and he said that he still translated everything in his head.
That's right. And he said, and he would say his prayers in Polish, and he said he would dream in Polish as well. And yes, and as I say, he maintained some of the traditions as well, like we didn't have nowadays it's different, maybe in those days others. Our Christmas Eve was the important time at Christmas because that's when he celebrated Christmas. The tree would go up on Christmas Eve, then we would have midnight mass, and then we would come back and we would have our Christmas supper. We didn't go to the extent of having the carp that he had in Poland, because I think he realised that was going too far. But we would go to the deli, which was a Lithuanian deli in Glasgow, and in the Gorbals, the Gudritis was the name, and we would always have a fairly regular order there for liver sausage, now called pate, Vienna sausages, honey biscuits, etc., etc. And sometimes we would go up and collect these from the shop, but more often than not, the order would be put on the SMT bus and brought down to the Lady Byrne depot, and one of us as children would go up to the depot on a Saturday and pick up this brown paper parcel of heavy, smelly sausage and biscuits, etc., which we loved. But as I say, I don't know many parcels of food that travelled alone on the SMT bus, but we did, because Dad was, that was our regular. And as I say, we would always have the Vienna sausages, etc., for our Christmas Eve, and we would stay up at Christmas Eve even as little children, because that was the time he celebrated it. And then I remember his brother in Holland would send us the Christmas cards, and inside it would be the wafer of bread, an unconsecrated wafer of bread, and that we would pass that round to each other, break off a piece at the meal table, and have that, another tradition. And then Father Gruszka from Glasgow, he was the Polish chaplain in Glasgow, would come down before the Epiphany, and the tradition was chalk all the doors with the names of the three wise men, and to us this was again a wonderful spectacle, and so on. So there were all sorts of things like that.
What about Easter?
Easter, no, Mass again, obviously, but no, there wasn't any big difference in tradition at Easter. It was mainly Christmas. I loved that. And as I say, and Babka would have just the one little half glass of sherry at that time, and I remember her sitting bolt upright, or my father would make cherry brandy, because he remembered his own father making the cherry brandy. And obviously as children we would watch, and then he would put a sugar lump in it, and we were allowed to have the sugar lump. That obviously led to a life of drinking in excess in later years. I blame that sugar lump.
Your father trained as a teacher then?
He did. This again took quite a while. He had his own business in Greenock. He worked, first of all, after marriage, he worked he applied for a job in Fiji after the war, and he got it, and we were all going to go as a family to Fiji, but it was vetoed because he was expected to do training here, and he was trained people in the Navy here for a while. I don't know what the reasoning behind that was, but we didn't have our life in Fiji. He then got a job in Cambuslang and travelled up and down every day on the bus to Cambuslang.
Different from Fiji.
Yes, exactly. And it was to do with cabinet making and upholstery. And then he had his own business, and he was a very skilled craftsman, but he was no businessman. And he had a shop down at a wee showroom down in Brome Street. It used to be a toy shop. It was a toy shop, and he took it over from the lady, and that was his showroom. His place of work was underneath the salon, which was the Clyde, which was a billiard hall, etc. And then it became the Clyde Lower Reaches Club
in Nelson Street,
George Square, and he had the basement underneath, and did quite a lot of Admiralty jobs of spraying, metal furniture, and it was like, it would be against all health and safety regulations, but we as children loved going down there and playing with the sawdust. There was machinery everywhere, fret saws, band saws, everything, but nothing ever happened to us. We were absolutely fine, and clambering over wadding and so on, because he made furniture, chairs, tables, etc., etc. But it was the era of Formica, etc., etc., coming in, and as I say, he was no businessman. and he was often to be seen with a chair on his head trying to sell it on a Friday evening, because, as I say, that he couldn't sell this type of furniture. It had suddenly sort of gone out of fashion. Wooden fruit bowls and wooden lamps, now back in fashion, but not then. And he would carry a chair round or something and try and sell this chair for money for the weekend, etc. And as I say, things were very difficult. The business, he had a very good friend in the local bank manager, a man called Bill Robertson, who was from the Orkneys, and we would laugh because he would come along and see Dad in the showroom, and somebody would come in to collect the refurbished piano stool that had been French polished and new upholstery put on it, and Dad would say, well, it costs such and such, and a wee old lady would say, oh, can't afford that, too much. And Dad would say, well, what can you afford, and then once the old lady had gone, or young, whatever, had gone away quite happily, Bill Robertson would shake his head and say, Joseph, that's no way to conduct a business, and without giving too much away, these people can afford it. So things, weren't to be in his own business, and so he said he was told to declare himself bankrupt, but he said no. He would pay back every penny to the people that, carpet, because he was, linoleum, everything. And he did. For years and years and years, people would come for a lunch once every month or something, and Dad would give over until he had paid off his debt. While he was doing that, he worked for GUS, a furniture store in Greenock. It was run by Wolfson, I think. It was away in the east end of the town, a big furniture store. I can't, if GUS was actually a lot of firms, but as I said, I could find out exactly that, and he did the repairs for this firm, and he worked in the workshop was above Burton's, the old Burton's shop at the corner. And the workshop was in between there, and Burton's dance hall was up above, and he did repairs. He did anything that was ever needed to be done, as long as he had a job and money, etc. Then he thought that, well, maybe he could, use his skills in other ways, and it was at a time when they were taking on uncertificated teachers who were not qualified. And Charlie Harkins, the head teacher of St Stephen's in Port Glasgow, was a friend of my mother's, very kindly gave him a job. They needed somebody in the woodwork technical department, gave Dad a job in there as an uncertificated teacher. And that was his forte. That was his forte. And he introduced the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme to St Stephen's and spent many weekends away with youngsters who would eventually achieve their gold award. And to this day, I have taught the children of these youngsters who have been so kind in their praise of my father and remembering the weekends away and the snow and the rain and camping out, etc. But he realised that, he should get some qualifications. So it was through Murray House in Edinburgh, had almost what you would call an early open university course that he could do by correspondence and by attendance, but while still working. And I remember many nights writing out his notes for him because, his spelling, he said, might not be up to scratch. And I remember, and he'd said, the old trick of, you're a nice writer, and I fell for it. And I was right out. He would dictate the notes, you know, to exam questions and so on, essays to me, and I would try and get him to change the odd word. No, this is, you know, it had to be just exactly the way I was not to change it to what I thought was better. So he did that and then gained qualifications. And he was so grateful to somebody like Charlie Harkins for having given him that chance. It wasn't a popular thing at being an uncertificated teacher, which is very understandable, but it was at a time of great shortage. And as I say, I think when it's a practical skill, it wasn't as though he was teaching English or French, and it was a practical skill, and he was, as I say, more than qualified in that respect. And until the day he died, he was a teacher, and as I said, he loved it. He absolutely loved it. And as I say, I do meet lots of people who he taught, and as I say, they are very kind about the effect he had on their lives. No.
Very good. So, is there anything else you think you should
as I say, the one thing I must say about my father was, you know, he loved Scotland. You know, he absolutely loved Scotland, and he used to get cross with people who complained, especially other immigrants from other countries. He got very, very cross because he said, we are here, we have been welcomed, and if you don't like it, then you know what to do. He thought this country dealt with people like himself so well. And you know, and this is not something for a camera, that this is just, I was brought up with that ethos. And he said it was wonderful, the freedom here, the freedom of speech. And he said it was absolutely marvellous. And he said they had welcomed his mother as well with open arms. And this is another strange thing. It probably wouldn't happen nowadays, but there was a gentleman along the road, a fellow called John McGranahan, who lived along the road from us in Brisbane Street. And John worked in the brew in the local, I don't know, department of pensions, etc. And he actually arranged a very small pension for my grandmother, for Babka. And, you know, my father was overwhelmed by this act of kindness. I mean, John wasn't giving him the money personally, but he actively worked out that, well, you've fought, you know, the son had fought for Britain, and therefore, you know, it wasn't what other people would go, but my father was, as I say, overwhelmed that somebody would go to that trouble. And as I say, he loved Scotland, and he and my mother actually, he would not go abroad, and he would go up north, him and my mother. They were hippies before their time. They had the orange and white Volkswagen camper van in later life, so that they could explore this country, so that he could explore this country. And I never noticed, like, my father's accent. I never thought he had an accent, you know, when he spoke English, and I couldn't understand how other people knew he was Polish or from a foreign land until I got married. And I phoned the house one day, phoned my parents' house. My father answered the phone, and I'm going, who is that? And that was the only time I noticed he had, a foreign accent was on the phone. And I thought that was quite a strange thing, you know, if you were a student of language, you know, there might be something in that.
He never went back to Poland.
He never went back to Poland. Friends of his did. Emil Lesniak, who lived in Port Glasgow. Emil was much younger than Dad, but had been in the Navy with Dad, because most of the people who settled in Scotland, most of the Poles who settled in the East Coast, and they were of an army background, and a lot of them were from mining backgrounds in Poland and settled in the East Coast and in mining communities. So there were very few naval people who stayed here. But Emil Lesniak married a teacher in Port Glasgow, Mary Rodericks, and Emil and Mary would come and visit us, and so Dad would have great times, you know, chatting in Polish and so on, and exchanging newspapers that they'd had sent. And Emil and Mary had gone back sometimes to Poland, and they'd, oh, to Dad, you must go back, and because we thought, why not? And Dad said, I think it would have changed too much. I think he was wary of that, and he wasn't the most sentimental of men. His home was here now with my mother and his family. Home was really where his, and the fact that Babka was here, because Babka died a fortnight after. Babka was in her 90s and had been bedridden for about 15 years before she died, and also her experiences had eventually told on her, and she had had a mental breakdown, which involved, you know, living in the past and imagining that the Nazis were coming, you know, here, and that was, she started to live in fear. And it got to the stage that sometimes my brothers couldn't go, when she was bedridden, go down and help to care for her, because males, it was the Nazis and so on. But my mother gave her wonderful care, and as I say, she died a fortnight after my dad. So it was a case of that everybody who was important to him was here, you know, and this was his life now. And as I say, as I've said before, he just did think this country was wonderful, you know, and he told many other immigrants that as well.
It's a fascinating story, thanks Veronica.
No, thank you. As I say, I always enjoyed listening to him talking, and I hope it's been of some interest.
Yes, well, I think so.
To people, and maybe there'll be others who can identify with parts of it as well.
Sure.